Greetings, science family. Today we're going to be covering the biological effects of radiation, thinking about, how dangerous is this stuff, radiation, and looking into what affects it and what doesn't. So I think this is good to look into, understand. It might actually lower some of your stress by knowing exactly what we're getting into. So let's begin. When we look at the types of damage that can occur from radiation, the first type is, let's think about ourselves, and that's somatic damage. So if there's radiation that affects us specifically and our cells, we call that somatic damage. Things like burns from radiation, like a sunburn from ultraviolet radiation. You could develop rashes or even cancer, which are abnormal cell growth, right? And that can alter eventually the way your body works and get in the way. So that's why cancer is so dangerous. But all that is considered somatic damage. And the thing is that you can see the effects of radiation somatic damage right away, or that's something that might appear years later. So this picture is a bit dramatic, but that would be of extremely high levels of radiation. Something like you come in contact with high levels of heat and radiation, see the fingers burning and dying in that. That's somatic damage. But again, then it's something so rare that happens rarely, just with accidents. Otherwise, we don't come in contact with that much radiation ever. The next type of damage we want to talk about is genetic damage, though. And that's actually damage because the genetic or DNA strand has been slightly altered. And because of that, the cells that are part of the reproductive organs and that can be altered as well. So the genetic code is slightly different, and that can lead to things like birth defects and that. So genetic damage is different than somatic damage because genetic damage affects the next generation, okay? So the offspring of the animal. So in this case, for us, it would be like if you were having a baby and that was affected and potentially a birth defect is caused because of the cells that were altered due to radiation. We call that genetic damage. All right, so how dangerous is radiation? Well, we're going to get into alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, who's stronger than what. But here's some important things to think about. First of all, how high energy is that radiation? The higher the energy, the more damage it can cause. That makes sense. But besides that, it's also how deep that radiation can go. So it's penetrating power, meaning will your shirt sleeve block that radiation? Is that something that can go through your body? Right, that is also going to affect how dangerous radiation can be. Something really important too is its ionizing ability, meaning if that radiation goes through you, is it strong enough to remove electrons from your cells? And if it does that, does it disturb the function of those cells? Having that disruption can cause different issues. Your immune system attacks those cells, and can that lead to any concerns? So the more ionizing ability the radiation has, the more dangerous it can be. And also things like, is it in the body? So if you ingest it, somehow eat something that's giving off energy is the form of radiation. Is it negatively impacting the body? Is it staying in there? You've lost your first line of defense, like your skin. So think about all these things added up, really determine how dangerous radiation is. So the way we rate or measure how much radiation and how dangerous it is through the unit of REM. REM is nice because the higher the number, the more dangerous it is for the person. So if you look anywhere like with 100 REM or higher, that's when the things get really, really dangerous because your white blood cells are affected. And if you get to like 500 REM, 50% of people who come in contact with 500 REM dose of radiation die within 30 days. If you take a look between 0 and 25 REM, even though you're exposed to radiation, there's no detectable effects on the person, which is interesting. So the amount of radiation you receive, there's like a threshold between just something that happens, you don't even notice, towards something that actually can be a measurable impact on your body. But the higher the REM, the more dangerous it is. If you think about REM, we get naturally occurring radiation just from living. Okay, so on planet Earth, just living on Earth, you get about 0.047 REMs of radiation exposure per year, right? The air that we breathe has radiation in it, about 5 thousandths of a REM. If you get an X-ray, it's about 5/100ths of a rem. That's why, you don't want tons of X-rays every single day. That radiation dose can add up after a long run. But take a look. The nuclear power industry, look at how little radiation there is overall. In fact, nuclear power plant workers experience less radiation than workers like outside in construction. Being outside, you're exposed to more radiation. A lot of people don't know that. But again, the higher the REMs, the more dangerous it can be. All right, so in order to figure out, is something radioactive or not, there's a few different things we can use. The most common one that people probably heard of is a Geiger counter. A Geiger counter, basically, when it's hit with radiation, it ends up making this charge inside the machine that makes a little electrical pulse or jump, and that in turn can make a clicking sound. So the more clicks or the more electrical pulses or jumps, the more radiation it's detecting. So a Geiger counter is one way, but just because there's a lot of radiation doesn't necessarily mean that it tells you how dangerous it is, right? Could be low-level radiation or high level, so it can be a little confusing. The next one's called the scintillation counter. Now this one, exposed to radiation, fluoresces, meaning that it lights up, and the intensity of light, how bright it is measured by the machine, and that measures how much radiation as well. So a Geiger counter and scintillation counter are probably two of the most common ways to measure radiation. But again, how much radiation you have doesn't always tell you how dangerous it is. It depends what type of radiation as well. So keep that in mind. The very last thing I want to talk about is kind of an offshoot, but radon gas is something that's actually the number 2 cause of lung cancer after smoking. So radon is something that naturally comes up from the ground and goes into the foundation and cracks in your foundation and into your basement. So it's found in your basement usually, and what happens is natural uranium breaks down and decays into radon. And what it does is it's pretty dense, so it stays lower in your house and starts to build up concentration in your basement. If you're in your basement a lot, over the years, it can increase your risk of lung cancer. And actually, it's silent. There's no odor to it or anything like that, so a lot of people don't realize that it slowly seeps up from the cracks in your foundation and sticks around. So it is led to believe that, it causes about the second-grade cause anyways of lung cancer, as I said earlier. But if you're a person who sleeps in your basement, has a room down there, so you're spending hours a day, if you haven't done a radon test in a long time, it might be a good idea to do so, just to make sure you're not around higher levels that could increase your risk of cancer later in life. Right? But radon is something that is a byproduct of a naturally occurring element, but it gives off that energy, and that energy can lead to cancer. Okay? Not guaranteed, but just increase the risk. All right, science family, in the end, we just covered some different ideas and looking into the effects on the body from radiation. And then from there, we looked into Geiger and scintillation counters for how do we measure it. And then our last little offshoot was radon gas, which just is something that I think people should know. In fact, in Illinois, if you buy a new home, you often have to do a radon test before you can sell it or buy it to make sure that nothing needs to be installed to make it safe. All right, take care, science fan.